Thank you for coming today. Let's get started. We're talking with today about the future of data. Some quick housekeeping notes. Yes, we will be recording this. I know that's the most popular question in all webinars, so we'll get that addressed right up front. Thank you to folks who sent in questions. You have helped make this session what it's going to be today. We greatly appreciate it. For those who came with their questions, feel free to put those in the chat or in the Q&A. Feel free to just shout those out as they come in. I'm going to be helping moderate that for Gretchen and for Doug. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me at any point during the session, but mostly after the session to help answer any follow-ups. You need slides, you need backup information, all of that good stuff. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Gretchen Littlefield is Moore's Chief Executive Officer. Doug Kaczmarek is our Chief Data Officer. Both are data gurus, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say about data and its uses today. I'm actually going to kick it over to Doug to start off, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the value of data, what types of data are out there as an intro to some of the topics to come. So, Doug?
All right, thanks, Nick. Can you see my screen? Look good? All right, awesome. So I thought it would be great to set the stage today. And when people use the term data, I think everyone kind of has different things in their head. And certainly depending upon where you are in your organization and you know what your responsibilities are, it's going to be different. And so I wanted to just kind of walk through a slide that I've used in the past to kind of set the stage for understanding what is consumer data, what are those types of things that we gather on consumers, and kind of comment about them and how they're used. So in this kind of two-dimensional slide here, I'm talking about what is the targeting power of data versus how it's used, whether it's used more in a brand area or more kind of in our world, direct response fundraising or direct response in general. So kind of walking through it, geolocation data, where you're going. There's a lot of companies out there now that are specializing in understanding from mobile devices, where that mobile device is. Are you visiting a car lot? Are you looking at a home listing? Are you in the market for a home? It's very powerful in general and information that can be used for very specific types of applications. Search activity. There's no doubt that Google and other search engines, YouTube, the data on what you're searching for is immensely powerful. Of course, the powers that be at Google and other places are not going to give up that data, but how it's used is for targeting advertisement within their network is just so powerful in general. In a similar way, the social media sites, again, within Facebook, their targeting technology within kind of the data that they have, voluntarily you give up a ton of data when you use their platform, and also they're obtaining other information on you. So what you're liking, following, all of that type of information. Certainly fundraisers can use social platforms very well with their lookalike modeling, but you can also use those platforms very well with your own data and your own first-party data ingested into those platforms. So again, super powerful, but not available generally outside of those walled gardens. Credit worthiness, wealth indicators, it's been around forever. Summarized credit statistics to be used in unregulated offers or regulated offers using the very specific credit data. It's still very powerful. It's still very powerful in the retail context, but it's also very useful information for nonprofits in particular when you're trying to understand the wealth of an individual and trying to make larger predictions around major donor giving or planned gifts. Just pure demographics and lifestyle and interests. There's a ton of compiled data out there from a lot of different providers. It definitely adds flavor to a lot of the predictive modeling that data companies do. Increasingly, I've noticed that a lot of licensed data providers are also taking critical looks at how they source their data and whether or not they're sourcing their data in a first-party compliant way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, I'm sure. So some elements have been going away over time with licensed data, but there's a lot of richness there, and it's definitely useful, but it's not really going to be as useful as what's to come here. That data, that lifestyle data, often gets boiled up into different products that the compilers produce around segmentation, and they give like nice catchy names to them, like pickups and shotguns and that kind of good stuff. Those segmentation products can be great, but they generally lack kind of what we need to be very specific for direct response, but they can be really good for brand advertisers. Survey response data, in the surveys of the past, not so great. In the surveys of today, where you can get massive scale online and you can generate literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of survey response, that data tends to be better because of the coverage of it. So getting people to talk about who they are and what they believe in and what might ail them, for example, that information is very useful, primarily because of the large scale around it these days. So it needs to be part of the data portfolio when you're making predictions. And then finally, the big bubble in the upper right here. This is what direct marketing has been all about for a long time. It's what direct response is all about, and it's definitely what the co-op world is all about. Understanding specific individual consumers and what they do with their money and how they spend their money. What are they subscribing to? How do they spend their money in relation to travel and entertainment? What types of merchandise are they buying? Are they buying it online or through brick and mortar stores? And what types of service contracts do they have? And then, everything within the nonprofit space around their charitable donations. So understanding, are they likely to give to a veteran service organization? Are they likely to give to a left-leaning political candidate? Are they likely to give to a animal welfare group? That past information is always by far the most predictive around what that consumer is going to do going forward and where their interests lie, and understanding that person. And so that's really the basis for how co-ops came into existence 30 years ago, and how they've structured the business model around looking at all that transactional behavior, making sense out of it, creating data variables around it, and then putting it to use to actually target new prospects, new donors, or existing donors to win back for lapsed, those types of donor journey types of work. So again, it's individual level consumers and a wealth of data across a lot of different spectrums and categories and collection methodologies that all comes together to kind of form what is the basis for predictive modeling and direct marketing. And so with that in mind, we wanted to go through and answer some questions.
Thank you, Doug. So with all of that in mind, and with all of the different ways that someone can get data, we did have a question about what a CDP is. How important is it to a nonprofit? Is it relevant for a nonprofit? And how does it get used? So Doug, Gretchen?
Well, CDPs allow large amounts of data that's coming from all kinds of different sources to be activated in real time. And we actually have a video that covers this in a very practical way. And Nick, if you've got that, maybe we can tee it up and show it to the group so people can see how it works in real life.
Okay. Video on Zoom is always a bit of a roll of the dice, so let's give it a shot here. I will also put that into the chat, link to the video.
Every day, we're on the ground in Honduras and Central America, helping spread the love of God to those affected by poverty and natural disasters. To learn more, visit helphondurasnow.org.
in Honduras and just wanted to say thank you and show you how your gift is helping children and families.
So, Gretchen, take it away.
Well, so that video does a great job of explaining how data coming from lots of different sources is first unified, then analysis happens to determine how the donor should be communicated to, and then the data is activated. So the person is contacted through multiple channels. So, and that's CDP stands for Customer Data Platform or Constituent Data Platform. And in its most basic level, it allows for marketing automation. And most fundraisers are familiar with marketing automation for their digital programs, and it's pretty widely used at this point. But there are very few people that are using CDPs to bring together offline and online communication and respond in an automated way quickly.
Yeah, I think it's really cool because we're now using data in this environment to not just say who to promote to, who to try to get the next donation from. It's answering really all of the questions. It's what channel, it's when, it's what do you say to them, it's how much should you ask for, should you move them up the value chain. And it's doing all of those things in real time or near real time to leverage all that information and machine learning and truly optimize how the fundraising cycle looks like and works.
And I know when I was managing nonprofit databases, we had more than a dozen of them, and I kept trying to kill them off like weekend house guests in an Agatha Christie novel. And it's a challenge. And so one of the things that you've talked about is how important identity resolution is to bring this data in and get a coherent view of it. Can you explain what identity resolution is and why you named the company after it?
Sure, most definitely. It's fundamental to everything we do, right? So how do we know who, for example, the woman in that video is across all of those channels without being able to pull that information together? Her postal address, her device ID, her email address, all of that information across many different data sources, from licensed data to first-party data. You've got to resolve all that information back to that individual and individual record within the CDP to be able to take the most optimal actions with that person. If you have duplicates within your file, we all know how duplicates are. You make suboptimal decisions. If it's direct mail, you end up mailing two mail pieces. If it's the same person at two different email addresses, you're spitting out two emails. So identity and how to use identity and resolving back to individuals is really fundamental to any data company. There's a lot of new techniques and raw data elements out there available, and actually using machine learning and predictive algorithms to pull together that information and not just doing the classic merge purge fuzzy logic from 20 years ago.
We often talk about the CDP is in some ways like a really big merge purge with lots of data that's happening in real time that never really ends because the merge never turns off, because data is flowing in at a high velocity, it's matching in real time, we're ingesting it, decisions are being made, and then it's pushing it out. And, you know, it could be an email, it could be an SMS campaign, or it could be a mail piece. And that's something that's really different from what has happened over the last 10 years is digital print, because of CDPs, is becoming a real customizable donor experience. And it's very different from what marketing was like 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
And people, once you have that data, people begin to expect it, that it's not just a nice to have, it's a need to have. And
it's a better experience for the donor.
Yeah.
Because it's customized and it's relevant for what's happening at that moment. And the piece of paper, the letter, actually becomes a digital canvas.
Yeah, I think, and it's funny, the phrase that Gretchen used, the merge, and it never ends. We liked it so much we put it on a T-shirt, and it's true. Like the quickness in today's technology, operating kind of data companies in the cloud and the database technologies, you get new data elements. They get merged in, if you will, through the identity process in real time, and you can act upon that data in real time. So the merge never ends.
And so if you were wondering at what level of data geek are you talking about and hearing from today, they have the merge never ends t-shirts. So if you have questions for Gretchen or for Doug today, feel free to put them in the chat and in the Q&A. One of the things that you said there is this is kind of a need to have. So how does someone, what's the importance of that comprehensive first party data strategy? And more importantly, how do I convince my boss of doing this is one of the questions we're getting in.
Yeah, first party data is ultimately the biggest driver, and understanding who your donor is across your organization and having the rights to use that data is super important. Knowing what they've done with your organization, the amounts of the transactions, how they came to you, through what sources, and having all that information aggregated in such a way that you can fully utilize it really quickly. It's paramount in today's world.
I think maybe talking a little bit more about the identity graph component of how CDPs work would be helpful too. You know, in the past, we were talking about the merge never ends. In the past, merge purge was name and address, and typically it was a hard hit on name and address, maybe a little fuzzy logic on name or street spelling. But in the new world, it's matching not just off of your physical address, but it's one unique ID, chaining together multiple email addresses, cell phone numbers, historical addresses, different spellings of an address. There are many different ways to hit a match key and make and identify a person, which allows for data to come in from all kinds of different sources and to be matched in real time and activated. And that's, to me, just super exciting. But I might be a dork to your point, Nick. I think merge purge is thrilling. I could talk about it for hours.
Now, we know that this is an area where you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the better. We want to keep iterating and keep improving. So one of the things that you've seen over the past year, tomorrow's Simio audience's first anniversary, we're very excited about that. So over the past year, you've seen hundreds of different data sets from hundreds of nonprofits. What are some of the biggest steps that a nonprofit can do to improve their data infrastructure that y'all have seen?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is what I said a second ago, which is having the data be integrated within an organization. We see, because we have visibility into hundreds of client organizations, that quite often their direct mail donors are siloed from the digital donors, which are siloed from the mid-level and the major gifts. So really getting a clear picture of who their donor is often even difficult within an organization, let alone sending it outside of house to a data company or modeling company like Simio to attempt to build good predictive solutions for them. So a data strategy around how to pull all that information internally and then how to share it appropriately, and really put investment behind it. Like too often there are questions we have about a client's data that they haven't even considered because they're not cleaning their own data appropriately. And I should add that it's not unique to the nonprofit space. We've seen this, I've seen it in my career in commercial environments. It's a challenge to manage your own data or manage a vendor who's managing your data and make sure that everything is clicking and all of the information is coming through in the right way, and having folks that put eyeballs to the data and QC it. It takes time and effort, and it has to be there kind of from management on down.
I would say that first of all, nonprofits are some of the smartest marketers out there. They're the most creative. They're not selling a product that is specific where you're sending someone a tangible item most of the time. So, you know, nonprofit marketers are some of the smartest marketers in the sector. When I think about some of the challenges and what keeps people from being able to use their data in the most effective way, it's often about competing interests within the organization. So it could be silos between departments. Maybe you have one group that is digital, another that's direct mail, or there's major donor, there's a publishing group. There could be multiple different stakeholders within an organization, each with their own data sets and their own CRMs. And I would say stop looking to have perfection in your CRM and consolidate all the CRMs. Quite often, you know, the CRMs that were created for publishing, for example, do a really good job for publishing, but they won't be a great CRM for you know, major donor fundraising, for example. Each has their own reason for existing. CDPs play this interesting role of being able to warehouse data across multiple data sources. So you could have a CDP where you're bringing and flowing data from multiple CRMs into a single warehouse and activating that data in that environment, which is much less expensive and also less problematic because you're not having to, you know, change CRM solutions. Everyone can still use their CRM in the way that works for them in their department, but you can bring the data into one unified platform and activate it. So again, like when I'm thinking about a CDP, it's three things. It's unifying data, it's having it in an environment where you can do analysis quickly, and then it's activating it. It's those three things.
So one example on that I've seen a lot is a new donor gets kind of a wealth screen, and lo and behold, we think that this person is likely to give a major gift. They have the means, the data is there. That name gets kind of like put into the major donor track, gets given to a major donor officer, never to return again, right? And so a CDP and understanding the propensities can play a role at saying, all right, the major donor officer has failed to do anything with that particular individual. Let's pull that individual back and also like have a concerted effort around other types of gifts, mid-level gifts, or just your annual giving, and not have it just be siloed and done and sitting on the shelf. Have it all working together more continually.
Well, and that's a good example of how you need this robust data stew if you're doing just wealth screening. The fact that someone's a $20 donor with the capacity to give $10,000 doesn't mean that they want to give $10,000 or that they have the propensity to make gifts of those types. Right. So looking at, so Simeo Cloud is an example of one of these CDPs. And for the nonprofit sector, looking at the complexities of all of these data challenges, you've talked about things like identity resolution takes, location data and IP addresses and all of these other things that someone may not have for all of their donors. So how would a nonprofit best use data companies to augment their data, to supplement it, and to help with this identity resolution process?
Yeah, I think, well, that's a really big question, right? Because there's lots of different products and services across like the range of what a data company can do. So with all of their information, you know, in that ideal world, they have everything put together internally. They share that information with the data company. And now what they can get back in return is everything from who are those individuals out there in the rest of the country that can, you know, become a good donor or sustainer from the pure prospect pool. That's the traditional co-op business model of finding new names. But on the existing donor file, leveraging all of the information within the CDP to understand who that individual is and what the donor journey might look like or should look like on a one-to-one basis and not on some big macro segmentation basis. So each individual, what's their likelihood to donate or to give a mid-level gift or eventually give a planned gift or major gift? and constructing different kind of contact strategies around all that. It's a very complex problem, and it takes data and the integration of strategy and creative together to pull all that together in the right way.
Identity graphs play an important role in what Doug's talking about, because it allows you to activate data and identify who a person is and think about how you're going to respond to them or communicate with them, not at a segment level, or as Doug likes to talk about, in buckets, but instead at a true individual level. So instead of thinking about your mail plan in segments, you're thinking about every single individual truly as an individual, because you're able to identify them through all channels and then determine what should be the next communication to that individual. Without an identity graph in place, it's impossible to do that. So if there's been a lot of change in the marketing world, mostly because of increased storage capacity in the cloud environment, huge volumes of data that you're able to store at a relatively low price point, and then the velocity, the actual speed in which data is being ingested and determined who that individual is, and then also just the sheer different types of data. It used to be that you could only ingest data from, you know, a particular format. It had to be a hard hit. Now we're able to take data in all different types of formats, and that's also called the 3 V's of big data. It's volume, velocity, and variety.
So it's really exciting. We've delved down into the individual level and talked about how automation and customization coming together with donor knowledge can really create that experience that we saw in the Donor Drives Us video. One of the questions we just got in the chat is, how do you manage the economies of scale that you have with mass mailing or mass emailing or large scale communications versus this type of one-on-one journey building?
Well, the technology allows you to automate the process of identifying a communication so that it's a lower price point in which you're making the decisioning, because it's driven through AI. In terms of, like, if you're talking about the economies of scale, like, you know, how many packages, that type of thing for direct mail, when you're using digital print, it's every single record gets its own customized piece of mail.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I said at a very high level around the integration with creative. You have to have a lot of different creative resources to supply the differences that go into that print, but you still get the economies of scale of mailing 1 million pieces, but you have, you know, 1 million different versions of those pieces, or if not 1 million, you've got more than the 4 or 6 versions that you might have in today's world, and so you have a lot more customization, if not true one-to-one. So I don't think you give up economies of scale if you're doing it the right way.
And sorry, go ahead, Gretchen.
No, I was gonna say, what's really exciting about the time that we're living in right now is you truly can have the same individual get an email that gets a mail piece and then sees a connected television ad. And it's just mind-blowing that this is where we are, but it's thrilling and exciting for the industry.
And if you take all of the things that you would want to customize and variabilize up front, let's say you have different messages for folks and different OE teasers for mail, and you have different treatments for lapsed donors versus active donors versus sustainers and all of these different things. Let's say you have 5 different of those variables and 5 different versions of those. Yes, you have to look at 25 different variables, but what you're creating is over 3,000 different versions of that package at basically the same economies that creating 1 or 5 was. And that's what's so exciting about this ability to automate customization.
I also think that speaking to donors in a way that's most relevant to them, there's a lot of implications for that. One, it works better. People tend to respond to mail pieces and digital ads that are relevant and make sense to them as an individual. But beyond that, it also means that we're opening up entirely new universes that we weren't able to reach before, because we're able to communicate to people in a way that's relevant to them, whether that's culturally or, you know, language choice. There's all kinds of things. And I don't mean just language like Spanish versus English versus Mandarin. That's not what I mean. I mean cultural, smaller little changes around how we choose to communicate with people. This allows for us to be far more relevant in how we're communicating, which I think also at its most basic level means respect for our donors.
Yeah, definitely like tone of voice, you know, kind of like reading level, all those kinds of things can be baked in and predicted at the individual level to, you know, it's almost exactly the same message, you know, in concept, but it's just said differently.
And that leads into another question that we got in about how are diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives impacting philanthropy, and how does that manifest on the donor side of things? Gretchen, I think you were kind of going to that right then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that almost most organizations right now have some sort of initiative in place that is around how do you reach new audiences, growing audiences of culturally diverse people. That's almost everybody has something that they're working towards around DEI. In addition to being able to identify new universes of potential donors and open up new audiences that maybe an organization hadn't thought of because they were only mailing lists that were the same people over and over again, this also allows us to customize the way that we're communicating with people, to start to aggregate which words are, or language or preferences even for images are important to an individual. We're all different in the way that we think and the way that we respond to certain words. You know, one word could mean something very different to me than it means to Nick or to somebody else. And there are trigger words too that you have to be careful of, and that type of stuff is we're able to manage to better in this type of an environment.
I'm here in Spring Hill, Tennessee, and once you get below certain, probably the Mason-Dixon line, bless your heart means something completely different than it does above that.
Yes.
We have a question in the chat about, are there limitations that printers or other vendors are going to have when using a CDP and trying to integrate that data flow?
If your printer has digital printers, then no, then they're prepared. And that, I believe, in the future will be a huge dividing line. In order to be able to do the type of fundraising that we're talking about here, which is truly individualized and customized print, you need a digital print solution. And that's not just on the data side, that's one component of it. When we're talking about CDP, there's also the organization of content, which is a whole nother webinar for a future, a future conversation.
I'm making notes. So we've talked a lot about the individual and customization thing. I'd like to turn the telescope around and look at how data can influence our messaging to all donors and the way that we think about things. One of the things that Moore does is we have the Neuro Fundraising Lab that helps to understand what cognitively people are processing our appeals to be. And now we have new data collection methods where people are wearing heart monitors on their wrists and geolocators in their pockets. And how do we use this type of new data to understand how donors are thinking in a global way?
Well, I'll answer that generally in saying that all new data elements that can be driven back to an individual you don't know how good it is and predictive it is until you put it through your identity graph, bring it into your environment, analyze it, and see how predictive it is. So, you know, some of that stuff that you mentioned is done on more of a smaller scale, more of like a focus group to give you a focus group level to give you information. If you can make it more widely known so that it has more coverage across your entire data platform or your entire organization's donors, then you can kind of do what I was just suggesting, understanding how predictive it is in different contexts. It's that sad thing where you don't know how predictive it is until you integrate it and you prove it. You got to go through the effort.
I have a dream of having very large panels instead of having the typical size panel that people typically use in focus groups, into the thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of being able to monitor information from something like this and how people are receiving ads and being able to ingest that information and then keep it and then push back information back the other way. And I know that there are many others in the data world who are thinking the same thing.
Yeah. Nick, I wanted to go back to DEI for a second, because I think it's just so interesting. And I view it as a different version of a lot of problems that we've had in the nonprofit industry for a long time. How do you find the new donor? Or now, unfortunately, we went through COVID and a lot of organizations had a really big bump to their donor file with new donors that are seemingly new to the whole donors environment for the first time, right? And all of those things in my mind bubble back to who are these people and can you predict who are the new and emerging donors? Where are they coming from? How can you find, if your DEI initiative is to have your donor base more mirror the community that you're serving, how can you find more people that look like them? And again, you can do all of that through the data environments that we're talking about. You got to have all the information in the database to understand those groups of people. But it's like, how do I find more people that look like my new COVID donors? Well, you can develop predictive models to identify people who look like them, who are likely to donate. How do I find more people in my community that more mirror who I'm serving? Same kind of thing. So the analytical techniques are very similar. It's just the type of group we're targeting and trying to find.
The challenge with lists is they're a circular reference of as Doug is saying, you just keep going back. You must, it's more of the same. So, and this type of environment, you're able to get out of the box of continuing to model to the same audience that you did last time. So.
Yeah, the classic one before the new COVID bump or the DEI was, how do I find more younger donors? Which was exactly like what we heard in the commercial space. How do I find a younger buyer? And that's not just a modeling problem, but it's identifying those people who are kind of aging into, if you will, the stage of life that is likely to donate to your organization, use your product. And so it's important to start with a database of everyone in the country and then understand the donor population within that, and then understand the people who are around the edge who maybe don't have a lot of demonstrated donation history from any organization today, but a year from now or 5 years from now, they will, and being kind of out in front and making predictions on those people.
And it's more than just the audience identification. It's, again, back to the content component, which is once you do identify these new audience of donors, how are you going to communicate with them? What types of language, what types of packages, what types of creative are you going to use to communicate to these new audiences? Because it's not going to be the same strategies as you used for the other audiences. The whole point of having an environment like this is that you're able to communicate in a way that makes sense to the individual that you're communicating to, and that's going to make them respond. So you need to make sure that when you're moving towards this type of a solution, that you're thinking about the creative and the content as well.
Yeah, and then when you were saying that, Gretchen, I was thinking also, well, how do you make that donation? And Bitcoin popped in my head. People who are younger and as they start aging in, thinking through, it's not only that message, but it's like, you know, if someone could push 2 buttons and donate 0.05 Bitcoin, you know, like you got to be there ready to do it. I know some organizations are testing that, but then making sure you're getting that data in the right way and understanding who those people are, so you can find more of them.
Yeah. They say that every system is perfectly calibrated to get the results that it already gets. And it's figuring out, Gretchen, to your point, having an audience of people that you want to be able to reach and finding the creative that goes to them already. So Doug, you talked about bringing in new and emerging donors into philanthropy. They're not going to have necessarily the same transactional record potentially that that donors would have before. So can you talk a little bit about how, from a data perspective and a strategy perspective, you pursue those audiences?
Yeah, it's where I started up front with the slide with all the different data elements. If you don't know or have a demonstrated donor history, but you have a lot of that other data, the survey response data, maybe transactional data from other verticals rolled up on those individuals, and just all of that other type of information that you can license and pull together, you can make predictions on those individuals for their likelihood to move into the new donor pool or the donor pool. And with that richness of the data, you can make pretty good predictions.
And we've talked about a lot of different data sources here of varying, let's say, sensitivity levels. And so one of the big discussions in the political sphere and in the technology spheres is privacy. How is the privacy legislation and other privacy efforts affecting nonprofit organizations and data systems?
Yeah,
Well, that's something that's, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Gretchen. I was going to just say, like, right off the bat, that was like the whole thing about first party data, right? When you have the right based upon the donation, that's what first party data is all about. It certainly is an interesting world out there, right? A lot of the Wall Street Journal articles over the last few weeks about Facebook and how they're using data and all the ins and outs of that puts a lot of pressure on the rest of the industry and a lot of visibility. CCPA, everyone needs to be compliant with that. You know, internally within MORE, we kind of extend that to really wherever you're at in the country. You don't have to live in California. We kind of follow those guidelines because guess what? Other states are starting to adopt legislation. Colorado has something, I believe Virginia has something in the works. They haven't gone into law yet. That's coming up. And so we monitor all of that all the time, and you have to have the right opt-out processes in place with your, you know, with your systems to do that and honor that. And certainly if an individual doesn't want to be promoted, you don't want to be spending the time marketing to them or fundraising to them.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that the Nonprofit Alliance does a great job of advocating on the behalf of nonprofits. It's a terrific organization, and it's something that I would encourage every nonprofit organization to become active in and join. It's a great way to keep up with what's coming down the pike. As Doug was saying, there's tons of stuff that's coming down the pike, so you make sure that you're complying with it, and you're working with vendors that are also complying with all of the different privacy legislation. But it's also just it's a good way to make sure that nonprofits are able to keep marketing in the way that they have in the past.
Well, and it may shock you, but not all legislators are also data experts because they come from a variety of backgrounds. And so some of the legislation that we've seen is very thoughtful and cognizant of legitimate uses of data, and some of it less so. And TNPA and others have been really vocal in advocating for strong opt-out legislation so that no one gets promoted in ways they don't want to, but still allows for data infrastructures to exist across the country.
What's unfortunate about some of the legislation that's been out there that's opt-in, that's with the best of intentions, but really creates an environment so that groups like Facebook and Google and others have a monopoly on data, because by their very nature, they're platforms that when you choose to use that platform, you're opting in to giving them your data, and they're amassing huge amounts of data that is outside of your control. So while that legislation is with the best of intentions, it really puts nonprofits and a lot of other organizations at a disadvantage and gives those organizations a monopoly. So
they're perfectly willing to set the ladder on fire because they're at the top and others are not.
Pretty much.
So Gretchen, you had recently penned a blog post talking about how all addressable channels are now kind of fundamentally the same because of these data systems. What in this new environment does it truly take to be an omni-channel fundraiser?
Well, an environment that is linking together all of the addressable different contact and points and want, like a CDP, everything in a single environment so that you're able to identify who the person is, bring in and analyze that data, and again, activate it out the other direction.
So one question that we had coming in is, with all of this being automated, will I still have a job, and will Sarah Connor be safe in this new, brave new world? So how will the job environment change as a result?
You know, we're all still going to have jobs. We're just going to be doing slightly different things than we have in the past, is the way that I like to think of it, which makes the world much more interesting, right? And it also means that nonprofits are going to raise more money and become more successful in their fundraising, which means there's more opportunity for all of us. So that's a really positive outcome from it all.
Yeah, I think from my background in data science, I was thinking about this yesterday. Having individuals that have the data science and the math background that can also interpret and communicate what the findings are. There's so many folks that are going into the field of data science these days that lack the context for what the industry is trying to do, and kind of linking the data and the technology back to the business outcome. So I think there's going to be a wealth of jobs in and around technical data science types of folks that can piece it all together and take the complexity of what we're doing and communicate with the strategists and with the creative teams to make it happen. There's going to be a lot of different roles available going forward.
A lot. If anything, I think the industry is only going to grow even more than it has in the past. I think, and while some of this does sound really complicated, at the end of the day, it's still the same concepts are still in place, like recency. Recency is king in marketing. How recently somebody took an action is the greatest predictor of whether they're going to take an action in the future. So the sooner you're able to activate your data, pull in that exhaust data, find out if somebody had taken whatever action it is, bring it back into a database environment, and then activate it, is still the best way to get a future response. And those concepts really aren't that different than they were 20, 30 years ago. It's just that we have better tool sets to get those things done. It's still a merge purge. It's just a really big merge purge that never stops, with a lot more data coming in, a lot more variables to match on, you know? And instead of just sending a mail file out to go to a printer, it's going to a printer and to an ESP and to an SMS. You know, it's going to lots of different outlets to market to an individual, but it's still the same concept.
Well, and I think you may have given part of the answer away when you said recency of donation is one of the more predictive things, but What's the difference between a lookalike model that something like a CDP, like a Simio Cloud would do, and one that Facebook or Google would do in your advertising platform?
I think the lookalike model, there are versions of that all of us data companies use, which is essentially saying, you feed me your target audience, your best donors, however you want to define that, or let me define it. And I'll layer my data onto them and go out and statistically try to find people that look like them in the rest of the universe. If it's Facebook, within the Facebook network. So they layer on their Facebook data, they understand who looks like them. In our data world, it's like who's made donations like they have from other organizations. One big difference that the data companies do that Facebook doesn't do, or Google does not do, is build like promotional based models. So here are all the people that we served an impression to, or we sent a mail piece to, who responded, who didn't respond. Now, what are the characteristics of responders versus non-responders? And those types of solutions tend to be more powerful than the lookalike solutions. They both work great, but the response-based models on average work better.
We have a question in the chat. When looking at these types of data infrastructures, how do you differentiate a general propensity to donate versus a propensity to donate to my organization? And how do I get kind of the unique donors who are going to be most supportive of me / us?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because the way I immediately think about it is, I don't think any one organization dominates the mind of a person to only donate to them. Unfortunately, people tend to donate from lots of different organizations, just like you shop from and buy product from many different organizations. So it's really hard. Like, if you have a donor who's donated to like literally 3 organizations repeatedly for 20 years, they're fantastic for those 3. And if you try to send them a prospect piece for the 4th organization, on average, they're not going to give. And so that's the beauty of the data science, is ferreting out all of those relationships within the data. And that's what the machine learning modeling does fundamentally.
Well, those are the questions that we had from the group. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to those attending for your time today. If you have any questions about anything that you heard here, want to hear more, had a question you were too shy to share, those sorts of things, I'm at N.Ellinger, that's N-E-L-L-I-N-G-E-R, at mooredmgroup.com, mooredmgroup.com. Thank you so much for your time today, and have a good day.